Welcome along, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome everyone in the auditorium tonight. A warm welcome to Professor Paul Sissons' inaugural lecture, and to everyone online. Okay, so a little chat about Paul before I hand over to Paul to deliver his inaugural lecture this evening. Bit of background: Paul gained his doctorate from University College London, where his thesis examined the long-term labour market impacts of past regional deindustrialisation. That must have been some read. Following his PhD, he moved to research post at the University of Dundee to work on issues of economic inactivity and the change in housing markets. He then moved away from academia for a time and held posts in the Institute of Employment Studies, working mainly on evaluations of employment programmes and at the Work Foundation on applied policy work. In 2013, Paul joined Coventry University and was conferred as a reader in 2017, and in 2021 he joined University of Wolverhampton as Professor of Work and Employment and Head of Management Research Centre. Paul joined Keele in 2023 as a Professor of Regional Economic Development and Policy, and whilst at Keele during that time he's become a key leader for us in regarding helping us move forward with our impact case studies towards REF, his leadership and mentoring of other colleagues around their research, and more importantly for myself, he, along with another colleague, is leading us through part of our AACSB accreditation and working hard to ensure that our societal impact is evidenced accordingly to ensure that we can move forward towards AAC accreditation, which is very important to us. Paul has published in a range of leading journals and has authored more than 40 research papers and policy reports. He has been an editor of the Journal of Work, Employment and Society, and Paul engaged with research, policy and practice development activities with central government departments, local and combined authorities and third sector organisations. Today, Paul will discuss his work on employment and connect this with current policy issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you, Professor Paul Sissons.
Okay, evening everybody. Thanks to Scott for the introduction, and thanks to you all for showing up and listening. So I'm never quite sure what you're supposed to do at these sorts of presentations. And a colleague told me to keep it light-hearted and include some jokes, which was really helpful 15 minutes before the lecture started. So I've had limited scope to do that, I'm afraid. I also realised when I got to the end, so the title is Good Work and Bad Work, that there's not that much in here about good work, and actually the emphasis is skewed slightly towards bad work. So it's not going to be particularly light-hearted, I'm afraid, but hopefully it will be at least sort of moderately interesting, which was the sort of bar that I was aiming at. Okay, so I've had a big long introduction, so we probably don't need to dwell on this too much, but I just want to pick up on some main areas of research and some of the things that kind of underpin what I'm going to talk about in this evening's lecture. So I guess the three main areas of my work really have focused on employment, but particularly employment transitions. So as people move from non-work into work and the other way around, and that kind of fairly messy bit of the labour market between unemployment and low pay has been where a lot of my work's been concentrated. Around local regional development, I'll talk a little bit about some of my work in this space, particularly issues around uneven development, particularly in the kind of UK context, as well as thinking through different sort of models of development and kind of policy applications around industrial strategy, etc. And the third strand, which I'm not really going to pick up very much on this evening, is around skills and skills policy, and a particular interest in employer demand for skills and how skills are used in the workplace. But that doesn't feature particularly strongly in what I'm about to say. So this is what I'm going to cover. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the dimensions of job quality, just to provide a bit of a sort of framework for the talk. The actual empirical work that I'm going to present is a kind of narrow part of job quality, but it's important to put it in a sort of wider context. I'm going to do a few slides just to talk about continuity and change in the labour market, so thinking about the last kind of 2, 3, 4 decades, kind of what's changed and what's broadly kind of stayed the same. And that's to frame the discussion of the main kind of empirical part of the presentation. So I'm going to talk about low pay and wage progression, and a series of publications that have looked at issues around the extent to which low-paid workers progress, so whether low-paid work that acts as a stepping stone towards higher-paid employment, and some of the kind of issues around that at the kind of policy level and at the firm level as well, and talk a little bit about the role of place and the role which place plays in shaping labour market outcomes. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of current research projects, thinking about the post-COVID labour market, but also link them to some of the kind of current policy conversations that have been very much in the news in the past few weeks, and indeed in the last few days. Okay, so dimensions of job quality. So there's lots of different frameworks around job quality, metrics around job quality. So this is one that comes from the Carnegie Foundation, and there's various different models of this, and you can think about job quality in an objective or a subjective way. So whether you're thinking about a kind of objective characterisation of job characteristics, or whether you're thinking about the extent to which an individual feels that different aspects of their job are high or low quality. So just to cover them off very briefly, we've got terms of employment and job security. So that's something that's been in the news a lot around kind of 0 hours contracts. Pay and benefits, so actual pay, but also satisfaction with rates of pay, and pay is something I'm going to focus on quite a lot in this presentation. Health, safety and well-being, both in terms of sort of physical safety within the workplace, but increasingly in terms of the relationship between employment and mental health and well-being, which can either be a positive relationship or a negative and a destructive relationship, depending on the kind of underlying characteristics of work. Job design and nature of work, so the extent to which people have to use their skills in the workplace, have some sense of control over their work. Opportunity for progression, which is something I'm going to talk about quite a lot in this presentation, and also an alignment with a sense of purpose with the organisation, so the extent to which someone finds their work meaningful, for example. Social support and cohesion, so both in terms of the sort of informal peer support that people get at work, but also the kind of formal kind of process around line management. Voice and representation, so again there's been quite a lot of this in the news recently with the change of government, etc., around trade union membership, but also the extent to which workers feel listened to in the workplace. And then work-life balance, so working in academia, we all have views and issues around work-life balance, and that's the other kind of thematic bit. But the bits I'm really going to pick up on are specifically around pay and also around pay progression. Okay, so just a few slides on kind of what's changed and what hasn't changed in terms of the kind of overall kind of structure of the labour market. So that, I mean, in terms of the sectoral composition of the labour market, there's been a significant shift, and this looks at what's happened since 1978, but you can take this back even further. So we've seen a kind of long-term decline in the proportion of the workforce who are working in manufacturing jobs, and that's gone down very significantly in the last 30 or 40 years. Where we've seen growth in a range of different sectors and occupations, but we've seen it at kind of both ends of the labour market in terms of thinking about the wage distribution. So there's been significant growth in some forms of professional employment, so in the private sector, in things like finance and insurance, for example, but also in various forms of professional services, but also in professional jobs in the public sector, particularly in areas such as health and education. So they tend to be jobs that have relatively good wages. On the other hand, we've seen growth in sectors which are typified by much lower pay, so things like hospitality and social care, where there's been significant employment growth. Excuse me. So this has kind of underpinned an argument about the polarisation of the labour market. So manufacturing jobs tended to be located around the middle of the wage distribution. So as you've had that kind of shrinkage of jobs in the middle, you've had growth in high-wage jobs on the one hand, and growth in low-wage jobs on the other. So there's this idea that the labour market's kind of hollowed out, in a sense, around the middle of the wage distribution, and that employment growth has been concentrated both in sectors that are high-paid, but also sectors that are low-paid. So another big thing that's changed is the distribution of where people sit in terms of out of work benefits. So there's been a big decline at least until very recently in claimant unemployment, but there's been a very big growth in claims for inactive benefits, but particularly claims for sickness-related benefits. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later in terms of what's going on, but you can see in the kind of greeny turquoise line, that's unemployment-related benefits. You see very big upticks in the recession of the mid-80s and the early 90s, and then you see quite a significant decline over time. So it spikes up during COVID. That's partly to do with the way that benefits were administered over that period. So claims were closed after 6 months rather than when someone actually left the role. So in a sense, that's an exaggeration of the actual underlying trend. But the general pattern has been for a decline in people claiming unemployment claimant benefits and a significant increase in people claiming different inactive benefits. And particularly sickness-related benefits. And I'll come back to this. And this has a lot of relevance for some of the discourse recently in the papers and coming out of the government in terms of potential changes to the sickness benefits system. So one thing that hasn't really changed or hasn't changed very much is the distribution of labour market disadvantage across different places. So this just looks at local authorities and looks at the claimant count, so the unemployment claimant count in 1992 and the claimant count in 2020. So the claimant count's gone down everywhere, so we've seen people move, or we've seen declines in unemployment benefit claims more generally. But actually the places that had the highest claimant count in the early 90s typically are the places that have the highest claimant count currently, or pre-COVID this is. So generally speaking, the map of labour market disadvantage hasn't significantly changed over this period. So the places with the weakest labour markets in the early 90s tend to be the places with the weakest labour markets currently. The places in the red circle are the ones that are kind of outliers to that pattern. So all of those are Olympic boroughs in London. So there's quite particular things going on with those places, both in relation to kind of employment growth, but also in terms of population change. So if you go to any one of those boroughs, you'll see enormous residential constructions, and actually the people living in those places, there tends to have been a change in the underlying sort of social economic profile of those areas. So they're the ones that are kind of big outliers in terms of that relationship. But generally, the kind of map of labour market disadvantage hasn't changed significantly over this time. Okay, so this is a neat summary of kind of everything that's gone on at different levels. So at the level of the economy, as the graph previously showed, we've seen this shift from production into services, both in terms of kind of highly skilled and professional service jobs, but also lower paid kind of service work on the other hand. Patterns of sectoral and occupational change associated with this hollowing out of the labour market. Declining role for unions and also general kind of labour market deregulation, although some of this is potentially beginning to shift in the other direction. And the growth generally of insecure and poor quality jobs. And there's different ways you can measure it, but the evidence is relatively consistent that work has become more insecure and that there's been a growth in a component of poor quality jobs within the labour market. At the organisational level, we've seen trends towards kind of flatter organisational structures, so starting in the private sector, but increasingly in the public sector. So the implication of this is kind of fewer rungs on the progression ladder as some of those mid layers are kind of stripped out. We've seen significant kind of inequality in employer support for training. So we know that highly qualified workers in the workforce get much more employer training than low qualified workers, and over time there's been a significant decline in the amount that employers are spending on training lower qualified workers in the workplace, okay? Which is a big problem when you think about wage progression for people who are in low pay. From a policy perspective, there's been a kind of a general kind of national economic model that's probably prioritised employment growth over kind of job quality, and you can see in different countries there's a slightly different relationship between those two things. And there's a kind of long run literature kind of explaining that kind of UK model in that respect of prioritising number of jobs over necessarily aspects of job quality. And we've had a policy framework around active labour market policy. So active labour market policy is the kind of active bit of the welfare and benefits system. So if you think about the work of the Job Centre, for example, that comes under active labour market policy. And that's really focused around entry into low-paid kind of bulk employment sectors. And if you think about the kind of logic of that, we've had a job centre system that's focused on the speed of moving people into employment, so it's been very much concerned with the speed of kind of outflows and placing people into available jobs. But because low-paid employers have therefore had a kind of significant supply of workers to fill jobs, to fill turnover, there's been no real significant kind of upwards pressure on aspects of job quality because there's a kind of ready supply of workers to fill those jobs. So that's the kind of overall policy framework. And I'll talk a little bit more about active labour market policy and how it's changed in some of the later slides. Okay, so we'll do a bit on good work. And this is, I suppose, a lot of this is kind of aspirational in a sense, but on the back of some of those trends and this kind of increasing recognition of the sort of scale of some of these issues, there's certainly been more attention both from the previous government, but particularly I think from the current government around what can be done around good work. So 2017 was a Taylor review of modern working practices, which talked about the need to redress the kind of one-sided flexibility in the labour market, where we have flexibility for employers but not so much flexibility for employees. So the previous government then developed a good work plan, which didn't really go anywhere, partly because we had a sort of succession of changing prime ministers and ministers in charge of different government departments. And then as part of the Labour Party manifesto was this idea of a new deal for workers. And you can see in some of the legislation that's now starting to go through Parliament, this is the kind of first tranche of measures that were articulated in Labour's plan to make work pay. So there's a sense that the discourse around this has changed, and now actually some of the action around it is changing as well. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about wage progression, and particularly wage progression for low-paid workers. And again, this is this question about the extent to which low pay acts as a stepping stone for a career or for higher-paid work, or whether people just simply end up getting kind of stuck in low-paid employment. So this graph looks at what happens to low-paid workers over a 10-year period. And so the bottom bit in the blue is people who sort of consistently escape low pay. So they move out of low pay and they stay out of low pay during that, or for the majority of that decade. So it's only about 15% of people, between 10 and 15%, depending which year you pick, who move out of low pay on a kind of consistent basis. So it's really quite a small proportion of low-paid workers who actually significantly move out of low pay. There's a big chunk of people who cycle between low pay and non-low pay, presumably relatively close to the distribution. So low pay in this case is measured as 2/3 of the median hourly wage, which is it's not an official definition of low pay, but it's a kind of semi-official definition, or at least an accepted way of measuring low pay. So there's a significant group of people who kind of move in and out of low pay, some of whom have periods out of work during that time as well, and around a quarter of workers remain consistently stuck in low pay across that decade. And that's important when you think about things like poverty in later life, for example, when you think about issues relating to pension contributions. Okay, so if you're in low pay and it's a transitory experience that has different implications for potentially for poverty later in life than if you're stuck in low pay for very long periods of time. So that's the kind of framing. So what I'm the next few slides draw on a a range of papers that I've been involved in with a number of really good colleagues and collaborators over the years. So the next few slides are really a kind of summary of some of this work. Okay, so what do we know about job mobility from low pay? So we know that patterns vary quite significantly by age and gender. So men are more likely to escape low pay, women are more likely to remain stuck in low pay. Partly that's explained by the fact there's a kind of part-time progression penalty, and women are disproportionately more likely to be in part-time work. But there are clear kind of gender patterns related to who leaves low pay and who remains stuck. Younger workers are more likely to move out of low pay than older workers, which kind of makes sense because some of the low paid cohort are people moving, for example, for university into short-term first jobs. When we look at the different aspects of progression from low pay, so people can progress either via the external labour market, so moving to a different employer, or through kind of internal mobility, so through getting progression opportunities within the firm in which they're employed. We see that external mobility tends to be associated with faster wage growth. Now, in a way, that's not surprising, and it's self-selecting because people would typically be applying for jobs at a higher rate of pay than the one they're in. So there's a big element of kind of self-selection with that. But when you look at the benefits of that external job mobility, they tend to decline with age, as does the relative benefit of staying with the firm that you're in or moving to a different firm. So once you reach a certain age, there doesn't tend to be a significant wage benefit to moving jobs. And it depends as well as whether these job moves are voluntary or whether they're in some sense involuntary, so whether they're interspersed with a period of unemployment, for example. And voluntary job moves are associated with bigger kind of wage returns, which is exactly kind of what you'd expect. In low-paid sectors, internal job mobility, and particularly given rises in the minimum wage, which essentially kind of raised the wage floor. If you look at the wage differentials that you'd get from a promotion via the internal labour market, actually they're really quite small and questionable in some cases, whether actually taking on the additional responsibility or which you might think of as additional hassle of a more kind of supervisory role, actually for really quite marginal pay increases. So there's not a particularly strong driver there often for people to want to progress, given the quite small kind of hourly wage differentials that some of those promotion opportunities offer. We can also see really clearly that the size of the internal labour market, so the size of the firm that someone works in, quite strongly shapes opportunities and outcomes around internal progression, but also the sector someone works in. So when you look at sectors that have lots and lots of low-paid workers, if you think about it as a kind of pyramid structure, it intuitively makes sense that for low-paid workers in sectors where there's lots of other low-paid workers, those sectors tend to have lower rates of wage progression than if you're a low-paid worker in a sector that generally is not a low-paid sector. Okay, the other way you can grow your pay is obviously within role, so not necessarily through a promotion, but maybe through time spent with an employer or through being able to negotiate a sort of higher hourly wage. So we looked at this with some employers in the West Midlands, looking at their approaches to wage setting for low-paid workers, and the extent to which individual performance did or didn't play a role in that process. So if someone's worked really hard, if they're very productive, if they've really applied themselves, the extent to which they're able to generate a kind of wage gain from that. And generally, individual performance is to some extent kind of important, but it's only one consideration that employers use when they determine individual wages, and it's often not the most important consideration. So some of the things that really strongly shape employer behaviours around wage setting relate to cost pressures, profitability, fluctuations in demand, but also kind of local norms around employment. So there's a sense that a kind of wage benchmark is set locally around what local firms are willing to pay. And increasingly, as the minimum wage, the national living wage, has increased in value for lots of employers of low-paid workers, actually that now is the sort of de facto pay review, and there really is no discussion of pay raises at any rate above the national living wage. The other interesting thing about those firms is actually you see very different approaches to how pay is set and the extent to which that's structured and systematic versus the extent to which it's really quite ad hoc. So if you think about kind of large employers, public sector employers, universities, etc., you see quite a rigid kind of pay system and quite kind of clear rules around pay awards and progression and all those sorts of things. If you go to sort of smaller employers in low-wage sectors, actually often none of those things really exists. And actually there's often no information for low-paid workers about things like salary scales, for example. And you don't know how you match up to other people or where you kind of sit on that salary spectrum. So it's worth bearing in mind that actually in different parts of the labour market, this really does look quite different to the sort of professional and the university environment in terms of how we think about different kind of pay systems and the extent to which it's structured versus the extent to which it's really quite ad hoc. Okay, and I just want to say a few things about active labour market policy, and this links to a current research grant that we started recently. So as I said, the role of active labour market policy really in the UK over the last sort of 15, 20 years has been about the speed of moving someone into employment or even off unemployment. So essentially, the concern has been around pre-employment and it's been around employment entry. So it's like get someone into a job and that's kind of job done. But it's been largely premised on placing people into these kind of bulk, low-paid sectors. So essentially placing people into jobs that don't offer very good opportunities for progression, don't offer particularly good opportunities for training and career development and all those other things. And as I said before, through that sort of model, there's not really a strong imperative for employers to change their practices and become more attractive because you have a kind of ready supply of labour to fill those roles. So more recently, there's been a kind of policy interest in thinking about retention within employment. So initially there was concern about what's called the low pay, no paid cycle. So this is basically people moving into low paid and relatively poor quality jobs and then find themselves back on benefits in a relatively short period of time, going into another kind of comparatively poor quality job and back to benefits and so on. So there's been a focus on retention. So how to encourage people to kind of stay in work or to support them to stay in work. And more recently, there's been an emphasis on in-work progression. So actually thinking about what happens to someone once they're in the workplace, what the kind of next steps are, and the extent to which that might also support kind of more sustainable long-term outcomes. But much more is known about pre-employment and employment entry stage in terms of what works, because that's been where the focus of policy has really been orientated. Okay, so the top bit I've kind of covered, but we can see that progression is now embedded in some of the recent welfare changes. So universal credit for the first time has a kind of in-work and an in-work conditionality component. So this kind of follows people from unemployment to employment and has implications for what they do once they're in work in terms of increasing their hours and growing their wages. So there's an intention with universal credit that workers who move into low-paid jobs will be supported to progress to sort of higher-paid work as part of the kind of active labour market policy set up around the benefit. The Department for Work and Pensions established an in-work progression commission to try and understand some of the kind of barriers that low-paid workers face to progression. And there's an employment white paper, which I think we published this side of Christmas, from the Department for Work and Pensions, which is probably also going to have a fairly significant component around in-work progression, particularly linked to universal credit. So it's an area where there's been kind of increasing interest, but a sense that there's not actually that much evidence about how you effectively do some of these things. And actually, if you think about the existing model of active labour market policy that's been about prioritising speed of offloads and moving people into the sort of first jobs that are available, that's predicated on a quite a particular notion of employment engagement that's very focused on that job match. That's quite a different set of logics to if you're then thinking about actually what happens to that individual once they're in the workplace. So essentially, universal credit creates this kind of tripartite relationship where you've got the individual, you've got the employer, and you've got the government, all of whom have some interest in what happens to that individual once they're in the workplace. And if you think about the conversations that the job centre might have with the individual and might have with the employer, there's all sorts of kind of complexities with that. So if you're placing an individual in a particular job, but then encouraging them that actually they want to move on and progress to something else, that has obviously implications for the employer. Should the individual be asking their employer for opportunities for progression? Should the job centre be applying emphasis on individuals to do that? So it creates quite a different set of relationships that I think are still being kind of worked through in terms of actually what that might look like in practice. And it raises all sorts of questions about the timing of interventions. So once you place someone in work, over what time frame would they be wanting to progress? So presumably it's not on first entry. In terms of how you practically manage that, so there's been emphasis on looking at wages as being the kind of key determinant of progression, but potentially that misses some of the wider important aspects around job fit, so hours, flexibility, sick pay, employer benefits. Also, wage rates aren't necessarily fully comparable between jobs. If you're not being paid for travel time, for example, in social care, whether you're paid or not paid for breaks, things like that can actually make quite significant differences to how you might view different sets of hourly rates. There's also clearly risks around job changing, both in terms of the real risks that you get somewhere and find that you don't like it, and we've probably all been to places and then found out it's not quite what we thought. But also kind of perceived risks. So there's a kind of risk aversion to job changing. And if you look at job changing in general over time, job-to-job flows tend to be, when the economic environment is quite risky, people tend to move jobs less often. So there's a kind of perceived risk around job changing as well. But also fundamentally, if the UK model, if the thinking of the UK model is around supporting people once they move into work, and some form of kind of job centre role in terms of supporting individual progression, actually most of the most promising kind of international evidence is less about supporting people once they're in work, and actually is about looking at good employment matches to begin with. So where you have, for example, significant incidents of vocational training and then matching people into good jobs in the first place, seems to be preferable to putting someone into a poor quality job and then trying to support them to progress. But fundamentally, that's a very different model, and a very different model to the kind of underpinning principles of active labour market policy as practiced kind of in the UK context. Okay, so these are all some of the questions that we're going to explore through this research project, so funded by the Nuffield Foundation with colleagues at Manchester Met and University of Birmingham, where we're going to kind of investigate some of these issues around how universal credit is working for claimants, what in-work conditionality looks like, and fundamentally whether that is improving the quality of job matches, whether it's increasing human capital, or actually whether it's just kind of blithely incorporating a kind of conditionality regime into the sort of progression part of the pathway in a way that doesn't necessarily generate advantageous longer term outcomes. So definitely more to come on that in the future. Okay, so The next couple of slides are more around kind of place and pay and progression. And this is some older work, but I think it's still relevant, and particularly relevant in terms of some of the current context around some of the thinking around the sort of the distribution of jobs and the kind of current thinking around things like productivity and economic growth. So most of what I'm going to say comes from these two papers, one of which looks at inclusive growth, and the other one which looks at progression for low-paid workers and the difference that where they're located has. Okay, so inclusive growth. So there's, I think, particularly kind of post-global financial crisis, there was this kind of period of searching in developed countries, and this sense that the benefits of economic growth are not necessarily shared very equitably. And part of this came out of the global financial crisis, and this sense that a relatively small proportion of the population had kind of built up systemic issues in the system, and subsequently everyone else kind of bore the cost of it. So in the UK, what we do know is that for a long period of time, economic growth has been quite geographically uneven and biased towards London and the South East. So we tend to have higher rates of growth in places that are already quite affluent, and that's a sort of long run trend. So in this paper, we're particularly interested in the relationship between growth and poverty reduction. But one of the things we did was look at it through the lens of the labour market. So here there might be two primary channels that link growth and poverty reduction through the labour market. So it might be that growth increases wages for people at the bottom of the wage distribution, which might have an effect on poverty. Or it might be that growth increases the employment options for people with relatively low qualifications, which might also have an effect on poverty. But those things are dependent on the sort of distribution of the gains of that growth in terms of the quality of work, where those employment and wage benefits sit. So, for example, where the benefits sit within the wage distribution, but can also be influenced by things like changing in commuting and migration patterns in terms of actually who benefits from that growth, and all of which is kind of mediated through the benefit system. So in this paper, we have a panel data set of UK cities covering the 2000s, and here we're not combing, we're combining data on growth, poverty, the labour market, and looking at the relationship between growth and those outcomes. Okay, so I put this one up not to test your sight or because I expect you to read it, but I thought I should at least include some evidence based to what I'm saying, so you don't have to take it completely on trust. But let me summarise it for you. So essentially, what we find is we find little evidence of a relationship between faster economic growth and poverty reduction over the period of time that we're looking at. We find no evidence at all that faster rates of urban growth increase the employment rate of low qualified workers. So that's kind of mechanism number one. We do find a relationship between economic growth and wages, but we only find that above the median and particularly towards the top of the wage distribution. So if you're a worker at the 80th or 90th percentile, there is a relationship between economic growth and your earnings. If you're a worker at the 10th or 20th percentile, then economic growth is not associated with growth in your earnings. So overall, I mean, the results really suggest a disconnect between economic growth and living standards for those on low income. So try as we might, it was quite hard, particularly over the period that we looked at, to find kind of evidence of inclusive growth. So just a couple of comments on that in relation to progression. So there was a kind of descriptive sense because it was noted that low-paid workers in London look to have higher rates of wage progression than low-paid workers elsewhere in the country. So there was this kind of Dick Whittington effect. So there was a suggestion that there might be something to do with city size that might mean for low-paid workers there are better kind of progression opportunities. And there's very good existing evidence that for highly skilled workers, their wages tend to grow faster in bigger cities than they do elsewhere. Okay, so in large agglomerations, highly skilled workers tend to grow their wages more quickly, either because of better job matching, so there's lots of jobs, so you can match your skills more effectively to those jobs that are available, or through human capital accumulation, kind of over time within that city. But little evidence as to whether that applies or not to low-paid workers. So we looked at this. We looked at London and the core cities, which are the kind of 12 next biggest cities to London, and looked at it in relation to smaller cities as well. And so what you can see is, if you look at low pay as in the low pay threshold, so this kind of 2/3 figure, you can see a relationship where low-paid workers in London do tend to progress more quickly. And that's true whether you look at all progression from low pay, whether you look at low-paid workers' progression within the firm that they're employed in, or whether you look at low-paid progression through moving jobs. It applies through the different mechanisms. So the issue with that kind of descriptive finding is actually, if you look at the wage distribution, you see, for London, you see more workers who are very close to the low pay threshold. So essentially the effect you've got is lots of noise around that particular line. So each year you've got lots of low paid workers kind of moving above and below the line, which makes it look like there's a kind of London effect to low pay. So if instead you develop a kind of locally specific low paid threshold, so essentially you're looking at kind of relative progression, or progression relative to pay in that area, or if you take a consistent group of low-paid occupations and look at them in London and look at them in the core cities and look at them elsewhere, actually that kind of London effect disappears. So in a sense, the London effect is more to do with the specifics of the distribution of pay in London, rather than to sort of underlying mechanisms that are supporting low-paid workers to progress more quickly in the city. Okay, so almost there. So I know time is getting on. So I just wanted to very briefly just to talk about a couple of things that I'm doing with some colleagues at the moment, but also link this to some of the kind of big questions that have been raised in the last few weeks, really, in terms of some of the employment changes that we're seeing, and some of the policy changes from the new government. So we've seen kind of two quite significant trends post-COVID, one relating to vacancies and one relating to inactivity due to ill health. And peculiarly, both those things have gone up at the same time, which historically is not kind of what you'd expect. So post-COVID, there was a big rebound in the number of vacancies in the national economy. And for about a 2.5-year period, there was really quite high rates of vacancy. So they've gone down a bit now, but they're still slightly above the kind of pre-COVID trend. So we've had a period where we've had really quite high levels of vacancies. So up around 1.2, 1.3 million at one stage, which historically is very large. So one of the things I've been doing with a colleague at Birmingham is looking at, is using some big data of job vacancies to look at the spatial distribution of those vacancies, in terms of looking at areas that were more affected by the pandemic, looking at the kind of speed of rebound and the growth of vacancies post-pandemic in different types of area, but also looking at the sorts of vacancies that have grown in different types of places. So this is still work in progress, partly because every time there's a new data release, you sort of feel almost compelled to kind of update the analysis, but also because it tends to, it's sort of spawned more questions in some ways than it's answered. But to summarise some of the kind of early findings, so at the national level we have this really rapid recovery of job vacancies post-COVID, and we have an extended period where there's really quite high vacancy rates. What we can see from the Adzuna job vacancy data is some geographical variation in that, both in terms of the drop in vacancies during COVID, but particularly in terms of the speed at which vacancy rates recovered kind of post-COVID. So parts of the southeast, so again we're in the sort of more affluent areas, tended to see smaller drops during the pandemic, but also saw kind of quicker recoveries in vacancies post-pandemic. As well as some rural areas which were particularly kind of touristy areas, which had some slightly different dynamics. There's been some changes in the sorts of vacancies as well. So there's been big growth in logistics and warehousing, for example, which has been significant right across the board in all sorts of different places. But the professional vacancy recovery has been sort of more uneven and again more orientated towards areas of the kind of greater southeast. And then hospitality in some places, so particularly some of those rural areas. So we were using job vacancies essentially as a kind of proxy for labour demand. But it raises questions about also the interactions with labour supply, so issues to do with inactivity and population change, but also potentially the speed at which people are moving jobs, which can all affect vacancy rates in different areas. So we're particularly interested in this kind of observation that vacancies and economic activity have both grown significantly at the same time. So if we look at what's happened to economic inactivity due to ill health. So prior to the pandemic, it was around 2 million people. So currently it's around 2.75 million people. So there's been a really quite significant growth in a relatively short period of time. So this takes me back to the very first journal paper that I was involved in drafting, or at least the first successful one that I was involved in drafting. And essentially this looked at the kind of longer term growth in economic inactivity due to ill health, going right back to job losses in coal mines and in heavy manufacturing, and a kind of a sort of direct shift from employment to incapacity benefits, but also a shift into unemployment, and then over time a shift from unemployment into incapacity benefits, which in part was kind of encouraged by the job centre because it moved people away from the more politically charged measure of kind of claimant unemployment. But then over time, as labour markets in those places became kind of less gendered, a sense of competition and displacement that essentially worked around, kind of health and employment demand. So places where inactivity due to ill health have tended to be highest over time have been those sorts of mining and heavy industrial areas. But increasingly, it's not explained by the original people who moved on to sickness benefits. It's explained by weakness in those labour markets, kind of over the period since then. So if you look at the top 10 places for sickness benefits in 1990, you'd have it pretty much exactly the same list if you did the same thing now, even though it's a very different kind of subset of people. But the point about this is, in kind of previous instances, you can see a kind of employment shock and a relationship between an employment shock and rising rates of economic inactivity. In this case, we have economic inactivity rising at exactly the same time that we have very high rates of job vacancies, including in some of the places that have high rates of sickness benefit claims. So something clearly quite different is going on here, and so part of the task is kind of unpicking that and unpicking the components of that which revolve around health, which is clearly an important aspect of this, and the components which will relate to the labour market. So the extent to which there are mismatches in particular places between jobs and skills, for example, but also the extent to which there are sufficient opportunities for employment which is sufficiently flexible for people with health conditions to fill those sorts of roles. So that kind of mismatch has driven this kind of stuff, which I'm sure you've seen in the last few weeks around, job for jabs and job coaches going into hospital wards and these kind of reforms to cut rates of sickness benefit claims and all those sorts of things. Whereas actually the evidence on sickness. On long-term sickness benefits suggests that actually if you have a buoyant labour market alongside employment policy which is supportive and actually addresses some of the health issues as well, then that can really help getting rates down in a way that just simply changing medical assessments, for example, doesn't tend to do. So on that cheery set of images, I will leave it there, and thank you very much all for your time.